Welcome to the Medical Terminology Podcast. This episode is Chapter 3, Part 1, Study Tips Revisited. When most students get to Chapter 3, a feeling of panic sets in. It is a much longer chapter and contains much more information than Chapters 1 and 2. Students begin to feel overwhelmed and their confidence collapses. Well, I'm going to provide you with 3 tips that will help you deal with this feeling. The first tip is divide and conquer. From now on, the chapters are going to be divided into 4 or 5 major parts. This is indicated by the purple headings. If you look on page 60 in the 6th edition textbook, you will note the first part of the chapter covers the anatomy of the skeletal system, beginning with the anatomy of bones in general, then moving on to joints, and finally the skeleton. On page 71, the text covers specialties related to the skeletal system. On page 72, the text covers pathologies, followed by diagnostic procedures and treatment procedures on page 78. So to summarize, each chapter will cover first the parts of the system, second, any specialties related to the system, third, the disorders affecting the system, fourth, how to identify the disorders, and finally, how they can be treated. So if you think of the chapters in these terms, and if you tackle each of these sections separately, you're going to find the load much easier to manage. Moreover, each of these major sections has subsections that will further help you to divide and conquer. Now, the second tip is to use your prior knowledge. That is what you already know. You should be able to identify the meanings of some terms based on the word parts you already know. Conversely, you should be able to use the word parts you already know to generate new terms. You should not need to make flashcards or take notes or otherwise study, in quotes, these terms. For example, look over on page 72 of your textbook. You should find a term, arthrosclerosis, arthrosclerosis. Now that one should be familiar to you. What does arthrosclerosis mean? Well, arthrosclerosis is the abnormal hardening or stiffening of a joint. It's composed of the word part arthro, A-R-T-H-R/O, which means joint, and sclerosis, S-C-L-E-R-O-S-I-S, which means abnormal hardening. And in fact, you've seen that word before. We did that word back in chapter 1. Now look on page 73, there's another example. This is a word that you've never seen before. Hemarthrosis, Hemarthrosis. Now look at that word, think about the word parts in it, and I want you to guess what that means. Okay, did you come up with something? Hemarthrosis is the abnormal condition of blood in a joint. This term's composed of 3 word parts, which you already know. Hemo, H-E-M/O, which refers to blood. Arthro, A-R-T-H-R/O, which refers to joint. And osis, O-S-I-S, which means abnormal condition. So we have blood, joint, abnormal condition. Putting it all together, we have an abnormal condition of blood inside a joint. You're going to find other terms in the chapter that contain new word parts, but they also have familiar ones as well. For example, on page 73, you should find a term chondromalacia. CHONDROMALACIA. This breaks into two parts. We have a new combining form, chondro, CHONDR/O, and we have a suffix we've seen before, malacia, MALACIA. Now, we know that at the very least, what is going on with this body part? What's happening to it? I hope you thought it's softening, because malacia means abnormal softening. Now, chondro is a new combining form, and that's something you're going to have to study and learn. And if you don't remember, chondro means what? It means cartilage. Okay, so chondromalacia is going to be the abnormal softening of cartilage. Okay, so bear this in mind as you're studying, that a lot of the information you already know. If you already know it, you don't need to study it again. You don't need to take notes over it. You don't need to make flashcards. So that's going to minimize your work. You don't want to find yourself making a flashcard for every single word or word part in the entire chapter, because that's really not going to be necessary. Now, the third tip I have for you is identify relationships. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is look at how the different major sections and subsections might relate to each other. One way of doing this is to think in terms of three major things. You're going to have a body part, that's anatomy. You're going to have something that goes wrong with it, that's pathology. And then you're going to have a procedure that either diagnoses it or that treats it. So if you can link those pieces together, you're going to find it's a lot easier to learn the terms than if you're just learning them all in isolation, like they're not related. Now, I'm going to give you an example of that. If you go back on page 72, where it introduces the joint pathologies, the very first pathology listed is called ankylosis. ANKYLOSIS. Now, this does have a new word part in it. Ankylo, ANKYLO, which means crooked or bent. And then we have osis, OSIS, which means abnormal condition, right? So ankylosis refers to the stiffening and absence of mobility in a joint. The joint basically has seized up and it won't move. Now, if you flip ahead in your textbook, look on page 79. The text introduces treatments related to joints. The second treatment listed is arthrolysis, ARTHROLYSIS. That's composed of the word parts arthro, ARTHR/O, and lysis, LYSIS. Now, arthro, we know that refers to the joint, right? Good. And lysis is a new one. It's a suffix that refers to loosening or surgical loosening as a procedure. Put together, arthrolysis refers to the surgical loosening of an ankylosed joint. We just talked about what ankylosis is. Ankylosis is the stiffening and absence of mobility in a joint. It's seized up and it won't move. Well, arthrolysis is the treatment for that. It is the surgical loosening of a joint that has seized up. So the terms ankylosis and arthrolysis are related. They almost look the same, but we can keep them straight if we realize that one of them is a treatment for the other one. And of course, with terms like this, you can also use the word parts. There are word parts here that we know already. But if you can find a way of linking them together, that's going to go back to that idea of chunking. It's going to reduce the load, reduce the amount of stuff that you have to learn. Okay, so please keep these 3 tips in mind as you're approaching Chapter 3. The tips are, number 1, divide and conquer. Number 2, use the information you already know. And finally, number 3, identify relationships. Excellent. Okay, this episode was a quick one. This ends this episode of the Medical Terminology Podcast.